or thereabouts. So thank you all. First of all, let me just express my appreciation to all of you, to everyone, first of all, for joining us this evening. I want to thank especially Tony and Adam and the entire team. Carol, thank you as well. And thank you, James. And thank you, Senator, as well. And Tyler, we appreciate your joining us tonight. We need your wisdom and input, your ideas, as we seek to serve the entire Commonwealth of Virginia, primarily those impacted by the opiate crisis of addiction. And there are people in need. So, and people who are looking to us to really make an impact in their communities, in their areas. So I greatly appreciate your joining this, our first Finance Committee meeting. And your input is valued because collectively we can make a tremendous impact if we continue to communicate, cooperate, and execute as we plan to do. So again, my appreciation and thanks to each of you for joining us. And lastly, I'll say that a lot of people are counting on us. So what we do has a major impact. So thank you all for that. Thank you all for what you're doing and for just being here tonight. And I'm one with few words. I just want to say that I want to thank, of course, Adam for all you've done. And thus far, we look forward to hearing the information and I look forward to your input. Adam, I'm passing the baton to you. Thank you for being there and for the information you're going to share with us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So do you all see a presentation there?
Yes.
Fantastic.
And I'll mute so there'll be no background noise. Thank you.
Fair enough. All right. So again, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and committee members. So I appreciate the introduction, the opportunity to provide this presentation to the committee regarding largely proposals for a long-term financial and budget strategy for the authority. So I'll touch on this again later in the presentation, but the hope here is with respect to the finance and budget strategy portion of the presentation, that following committee member discussion, that a consensus is reached on an approved methodology to use to develop a more comprehensive financial and budget plan for subsequent committee approval and recommendation to the board at a future meeting. So with that, to begin, here's just a brief agenda again for today's meeting. So I'd like to start by first reviewing the committee's annual ongoing goals and objectives, then quickly discuss the work the OA staff has been engaged in and plans to do in the coming weeks and months. And then the bulk of the presentation is really going to consist of a discussion regarding that longer term financial strategy and budget approach the OA and this finance committee would like to see implemented. So part 3 of the agenda would consist of a quick update on the settlement payments, as well as an update on the OA and the opioid settlement related items contained in the governor's introduced budget, an overview of securitization, and then a review of some budget approaches for the committee's consideration. So again, to review the committee's ongoing goals and objectives. So these are essentially broken down into 2 categories, one being the OAA's broader financial and budget related strategy, which would include the apportionment of settlement revenues to be expended for discretionary grant awards over a multi-year period, reviewing the OAA's administrative and grant related appropriations and language contained in the Appropriation Act, and then any necessary committee proposals for board consideration, and being made aware of legislation that may have fiscal impact to the OAA as needed, as well as a post-session summary of those items. So the second category more relates to the administrative aspects of the OAA, specifically with respect to its finance and procurement related policies and procedures, including reviewing and proposing amendments to the administrative budget, as well as internal financial control and procurement policies reviewed and proposed by this committee for board consideration, receiving periodic budget updates, and receiving the drafts of any annual audit documents prepared by the Auditor of Public Accounts pursuant to the OAA's statutorily required annual audit. Just a quick note on what the staff will be working on in the coming weeks and months, and already has really kind of engaged in some of this work already, but and this relates specifically to the finance and administrative operations and processes that are under the purview or might be of interest to the committee. So with both the chair and hiring committee's approval and recommendation, we've advertised for a senior accountant position to join our team. So this is already This has already been posted and will close on January 8th, and we're hopeful that we'll get a good number of qualified applicants to fill that role, which would assist in making sure the OA's finances are, of course, GASB compliant and otherwise sound from an accounting standpoint, would assist in general financial analysis and kind of policies and procedures development, and most importantly, I think, annual audit preparation. We're also proposing a multi-year or developing a multi-year financial strategy, proposing to the committee for later board consideration. That's part of what's happening during this meeting. Proposing internal financial controls and procurement policies for committee and board consideration. Will be actively engaged during the General Assembly session regarding legislation and budget items with impact and relevance to the authority. We'll continue to work with the Auditor of Public Accounts to develop local audit specifications, and then receive new settlement award information and correspondingly revise budget estimates as this information is made available by the Office of the Attorney General. So moving into an overview and discussion on financial strategy and budgetary structure. So first, I'll provide an update on projected opioid settlements to date. Next, I'll provide a quick update on OAA budget-related items contained in the governor's introduced budget. Then I'll provide an overview of securitization, what it means, what are the pros and cons associated with securitization, and then conclude this section with a review of a couple of different approaches to budgeting the discretionary settlement revenues over a multi-year period, again, examining the pros and cons associated with those approaches. So, Mr. Chairman, you'd asked for an update on the settlement payments. So this slide depicts the best estimate as to what the OAA will receive over a 20-year period, and this totals approximately $608.3 million. So this is reflective of the amounts that the Office of the Attorney General would have provided at the authority's December 1st board meeting, plus the estimates for the CVS and Walgreens payments. So this is the best estimate to date of everything that's kind of out there. And this represents the likely the total maximum possible payments, assuming incentives are met, which would determine the eligibility for prepayment or front-loaded payment amounts and that sort of thing. So these are fairly reasonable estimates, but the actual annual deposit amounts and totals will likely fluctuate, some as well as accounting for the disposition of any new settlements down the road. So it's a somewhat kind of dynamic model. Again, this is pretty reasonable and our best estimate right now for planning purposes. So there was also a question about the current opioid abatement fund balance. So I looked at that today, and it's still at about $71.9 million, and that's fiscal year 23, current fiscal year to date, again, as of today.
When we say fiscal year, we were talking about as of June 30th or as of December 31st, as a fiscal year or calendar year? How are we operating?
Fiscal year. So in terms of we receive, so we're for planning and budgeting purposes, since we're going to be, we have appropriations in the Appropriation Act and we're subject to those appropriations. We receive the funds obviously when on mostly, when they're received on a calendar year basis and how those payments correspond from a fiscal year perspective. So everything. So when I reference what's been deposited, that's on a fiscal year basis. So that's July 1, 22 to June 30. 23 would be the current fiscal year, FY 23. So that's yielded to date total amount deposited to the opioid abatement fund in the current fiscal year.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it does. Thanks for that clarification. Want to make sure we're in sync there, and also what we're dealing with because we'll be looking probably at, I would guess, maybe at least multi-year obligations to clients or bi-year budgets, biannual budgets, because it probably ties in as well with what the governor's trying to tie in with the OBIT fund. So
yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir. So and then speaking to the budget, so there were a handful of OAA or opioid settlement related items contained in the governor's proposed amendments to the FY 23, FY 24 biennial budget introduced last week on December 15th. So there's language and an initial appropriation provided under item 362.5, which is within the Office of Health and Human Resources, which establishes the OAA as an agency in the Appropriation Act. So we actually have a second year appropriation funding in the current fiscal year was provided administratively by DBB. And there's also language that authorizes the authority to request administrative increases to its appropriation. So in the near term, that's probably the approach that's going to be taken to adjust appropriations to accommodate what's needed, just based on the timing of things, but also kind of necessitates, again, establishing kind of this long-term financial plan and budgeting strategy, so we know what we're looking at in terms of this biennium, the appropriation needs, and subsequent biennia, and being able to plan for that and maybe right-sizing the appropriations in the Appropriation Act rather than relying on those kind of administrative appropriations. But I think we're going to be okay as it is right now. And then, of course, we have some other things budget related that we'll have to work on as it goes through the legislative budget process. But there is that language that establishes an appropriation that establishes the OAA as an agency. There were some other initiatives that OAA staff, with guidance from the chair and other board members, were fortunate to have provided information that helped inform how those items were structured. And that includes language creating a special non-reverting fund to receive the Commonwealth's direct settlement shares to be used specifically for abatement, and encourages the implementation and maintenance of performance measures. So this language would expire effective July 1 of 2023 if legislation creating a similar fund passes. So if you recall, there really was, again, these are the state's direct settlement shares, but there was no mechanism to properly segregate and account for how those funds would be spent, consistent with kind of the abatement purposes, right? So that's really a good thing that was done. And then there's funding of $7 million in FY24 of those Commonwealth direct shares that would be deposited in that fund that would be created consistent with that language to support costs associated with a statewide fentanyl response strategy. There are some other items related to, again, those Commonwealth direct shares, $5 million in the second year for a youth-focused public awareness campaign regarding the danger posed by fentanyl, and then $1.4 million each year from those same funds for DBHDS to purchase additional Revive kits and associated doses of naloxone. All right, so now this is I'd like to provide an overview of securitization. I know this is kind of a heady topic, so hopefully I'm going to try and keep it fairly high level, but it can get complicated. So please stop me if you have any questions or need clarification on anything. I'll have this slide, and then I'll have kind of another slide that discusses the advantages and disadvantages related to securitization as it relates to the opioid settlement fund. So this is, again, an overview, discuss how it would likely be implemented, and some of the advantages and disadvantages. So defining what securitization is, it's the process of issuing bonds that are backed by the opioid settlement revenues. So the authorization and infrastructure that would be needed to facilitate the issuance and management of the proceeds of such bonds would need to be legislatively established, and would likely include the creation of what's called a special purpose entity to issue these revenue-backed bonds, and to whom some percentage of future settlement revenues would be pledged or sold in order to service the debt. So the bonds that would be issued by this entity that would be legislatively created, again, would be either exempt or tax exempt, depending on their use. From what I understand, the opioid settlement-backed bonds would likely all be taxable debt. Tax exempt debt is typically reserved for capital expenditures. So with the vast majority would probably be taxable debt. So looking at a recent example of when the Commonwealth last did this, the securitization of the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement revenues about 20 years ago. Again, that's probably the best example. So legislation passed in 2002 that authorized 50% of the state's revenues derived from the MSA in the form of securitized bonds, and created a separate public body corporate called the Tobacco Settlement Financing Corporation. So this would be your special purpose entity to issue bonds and use the proceeds to purchase the Commonwealth's future tobacco payments. These funds were subsequently deposited to an endowment, and a portion of the corpus that resided in that endowment is transferred to the Tobacco Commission, and that's still the process today. So it was in legislation, 10% of that corpus was transferred routinely, and then up to 15%, which the commission refers to as well, they have a name for it, but anyway, they essentially raid the fund, right, up to a max of 15%. That requires a 2/3 vote that they customarily receive, right? So they, on a routine basis, they now take up to 15% of the total amount each year is transferred to the commission. So there are both pros and cons to securitization as it relates to the opioid settlement fund. So you have the potential, among the pros, you have the potential to receive a sizable portion of funds upfront, with which you can fund larger scale projects, including capital projects. You can invest the proceeds of the sale, and the return on that investment may exceed the cost of debt. And given that you've created a separate legal entity to issue the debt and you're receiving a discounted portion of future revenue streams, you're transferring some risk to the capital markets. So looking at the cons, depending on the cost of issuance, the present value of the net proceeds of securitization would result in lower net income over the life of the settlements. The use of funds upfront reduces the ability to fund future ongoing abatement efforts and may impact OAA control of such efforts. If funding is used for capital projects, the lack of out-year funding would shift the operational cost burden to other state or local sourced revenues. And given liquidity or cash flow requirements and the degree of risk you'd want to assume, the structure of the investment portfolio may reduce potential interest earnings. And finally, there's a code provision under 2.2-2374, which is the opioid abatement fund portion of the code that describes kind of the percentage distribution of the funds to the different entities. Within that, there is a statutory mandate for the OA to balance the immediate and anticipated needs with the projected receipt of funds. Are there any questions on this before I go on?
Yeah, one question, and then you did say it does require General Assembly approval. Is that correct to securitize? Does it?
Yes, sir. Yeah, you would have to. It would require fairly comprehensive legislation that establishes a number of separate legal entities that accommodate that sort of the whole mechanism that can facilitate securitization.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right, now looking at two different approaches related to the distribution of funds. And now this is moving into accounting for the settlement revenues from an appropriation standpoint over a multi-year period as they come in, as the funds are deposited to the opioid abatement fund. So this neither of these approaches would be applicable to the local 15% entitlement portion. But the funding that is made on a competitive basis for regional and state projects, and additional funding made available through the unrestricted portion. So under both these approaches, the 15%, what we call again the entitlement portion, would continue to be appropriated and distributed on an annual basis, consistent with when settlement funds are deposited. So to begin, there's what I've just referred to as an all-at-once approach. Where all of the funds are appropriated and distributed as they're received on an annual basis. So the only exception to this would be the OAA portion of the McKinsey settlement funds being used to cover the cost associated with the local gold standard incentive payments, which is kind of a set aside and then is used to draw down until those funds are exhausted, and then the payments kick in under the unrestricted portion. And then there's what I've referred to, for lack of a better term, measured approach. Where certain front-loaded funds that aren't already distributed over a multi-year period pursuant to a settlement agreement are spread over a number of years. So this would only apply again to the discretionary portion of funds, not the local 15% entitlement portion of funds. So I'll demonstrate what this looks like on this slide. So again, this graph depicts the all-at-once approach I referenced and represents, again, our best guess as the amount of funding and the distribution of that funding based on the information we've received. So this graph is reflective of the updated opioid settlement payment amounts that I shared on that slide a few moments ago. So here, all the funds are distributed as received on an annual basis for both the local entitlement piece and the regional, state, and unrestricted portions. So the delta that exists in the first year, you can see that kind of bracketed line reflects the McKinsey funds I mentioned previously. And you can see that for a few years through FY28, expenditures actually exceed the anticipated annual settlement deposits, given the distribution of those funds until they're exhausted in FY28, at which point they come from the OAA's unrestricted funds, and then expenditures and revenues match dollar for dollar until payments cease in FY 2041. So for a snapshot perspective of what this looks like in terms of the amount of money that would be appropriated associated with those revenues. So this would provide $140.6 million in the first 2 years. So this would be the first and second grant application cycles. And then the next 10 years would provide an average of $35.6 million available for local and regional disbursements. So kind of, again, spreading some of that revenue with the McKinsey is spread, but the rest is just kind of going out as it goes along. So looking at the pros and cons associated with just sending all the money out as it becomes available. So with the pros, a larger share of funds may be deployed more quickly for abatement efforts. This is kind of somewhat similar to securitization, but on a lesser scale, right? And given that that level of funding may be better able to provide for at least a portion of local or regional capital needs should they exist. Examining the cons. So this approach reduces the amount of funding available for abatement efforts over the long term. It would result in significant annual swings in appropriation, right? So if you're trying to match appropriation with the funds as they're deposited, it would kind of be, could kind of go all over the place, right? Which could make long-term planning a little more difficult. And then there's potentially a higher governance and oversight risk associated with awarding larger amounts at once. And so now taking a look again at what I've termed a measured approach, which essentially consists of, again, fully appropriating the local entitlement share of OAA funds and then budgeting the more discretionary regional and state grants and unrestricted funds over a multi-year period. So currently this would just consist of what is anticipated in Janssen and Walmart front-loaded payments in fiscal years 23 and 24 spread over a 10-year period. So here in the first 2 years, you can see the delta again. Those lines between revenues and expenditures consists again of apportioning the McKinsey funds for the local incentive and those large front-loaded payments related to the Janssen front-loaded and the Walmart payments. And so you can see then again, that's how the expenditures exceed that because you've taken those taken the revenues and spread the appropriation out, which exceeds those annual revenue payments. So let's see here. So this, so the payments at FY, so they exceed the revenues until FY33, and then FY34 it matches, the appropriations match the revenues again until they exhaust in FY42. So in relation to the previous model that put more money out, I think about a little over $55 million or so in the first 2 years. This would provide $87.8 million in years 1 and 2, and then would average about $41 million or so over the next 10 years. So you're sacrificing the larger slug of money in the 2 years, first 2 years of distributions, and then spreading an additional roughly $5.3 million over a 10-year period for other discretionary type grant projects. So now looking at the pros and cons associated with the measured approach. So again, it would continue to allocate to cities and counties all of the settlement revenue they're entitled to on an annual basis. And it would provide more funding, obviously, over a longer period for ongoing regional and state projects, and those augmented or funded with unrestricted funds. It would also provide the board with more flexibility to balance short-term needs with the long-term financial health of the fund. Given that subject to available settlement revenue, additional appropriation could be provided administratively in order to accelerate awards for critical projects. So even though you've spread those appropriations over more years, if there was a project that came forward where you wanted to move appropriation into the current, into the present, move it up 2 or 3 fiscal years, for example, you'd be able to do that. Excuse me, and then be able to accommodate a critical project that came forward. So you wouldn't be at risk, just assuming that there was sufficient revenue to accommodate that appropriation. You wouldn't be at risk of not being able to fund a project that you wanted to fund. Looking at the cons, so there's less funding budgeted in the first 2 years for regional and state projects. And it does treat appropriation available funding for awards for cities and counties differently than regional and state awards. Okay, and then just wrapping up here. So looking at next steps to be taken by staff and what's expected of the committee in the coming weeks and months. So staff is going to continue to work with DPB again to administratively adjust appropriation as needed. We'll work with Money Committee staff and members as necessary during the 2023 legislative and budget development process as it relates to the OAA and opioid settlement funds. And it's anticipated that the committee will reconvene at a to be determined future date or dates to review and adopt for board consideration a comprehensive long-term financial and budget plan after we've received guidance on kind of the foundational methodology of how we'd like to do that, which is kind of the point of this evening's presentation. A comprehensive long-term or review and adopt for board consideration our internal financial controls and procurement policies, and then review and update on or receive an update on budget and legislative items from the 2023 session. And let's see, and then update on OAA financials and the disposition of pending settlements if those aren't otherwise reflected in the comprehensive financial plan that would be presented for adoption, and then any other germane items as necessary. So that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chair, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, certainly. Questions and comments. One comment is in term, either way the committee / recommends to the authority will need to sort of determine, maybe if we need a financial advisor, if we were to securitize the bond or debt, which is somewhat premature. Also, one other aspect would be able to ascertain what the needs are in terms of what the localities will request when we have the grants and the other appropriations and distributions. So ascertaining the needs, a lot of that may drive decisions. So we have a lot to discuss. For example, the cost of debt. But before I get that far downstream, I certainly like to hear from other members of the committee. But I think we have to really sort of ascertain what our needs will be for distribution purposes, and of course, just where we are and how we want to do it, because this will be a significant decision that may tie us up for years to come, either way we approach. So we'll certainly need some good financial advising on that portion of it as well. Now, the question also is, what decisions do we need to make tonight in terms of recommending, and when do we expect, Mr. Chair, a full authority board meeting to consider and contemplate strategies going forward? What's the best strategy going forward, and that sort of thing. So I'm sort of throwing that out, some ideas and comments for other members of the committee to weigh in as we discuss the pros and cons.
Mr. Holland, this is Tony. I would, if I may, I'd just like to
Please
add a little bit of context. We, on January 19th, we're going to be opening up the application process for cities and counties.
Okay.
And we know down to the dollar how much each city and county is able to apply for and to receive. So we don't, we're not asking the committee for guidance on that piece of it, but before we can open up the application period for regional projects and for state agencies, we need to have a sense of how much money we will be able to distribute on an annual basis for regional projects and for state agencies. And that's the reason why we brought to you with some urgency this question about, just because we have money in the bank, so to speak, should we automatically give 35% of it to whatever regional projects come in that the board wants to fund, or should we save some of that funding for the future? And the recommendation from me is to think about, if you're looking at a regional project, do we want it to be a flash in the pan in the first year and fund it all at once, or do we want to be able to fund it at a consistent level over a longer period of time? And I think that's sort of the philosophical question we're bringing to the committee for regional projects and for state agency funds that we would give to state agencies for new state or expansion of state projects and efforts.
Thank you for that clarification, because it's important that we, I'm concerned also because if we give too much money out, is it going to be spent appropriately and accounted for appropriately? Now, we can't assume that's going to occur, even though it's going through the cities and counties and the governing bodies of the municipalities, counties and cities. We have to, I think, be reserved somewhat in terms of what we're going to receive and expect back. So I tend to have a conservative approach until we know how well it's going to be spent. So that's a comment I would certainly make. Well, others may have a different opinion on it. I tend to be relatively conservative and not put everything out until we have a measured, reasonable expectation of utilization of those funds. And I'm glad we have an amount that is allocated, as you pointed out, maybe even down to the penny to localities. So the big challenge will be the regional projects for the most part, that may require larger outlays. That's what I envision, which could be capital and operation.
Well, we have the ability to set up the financial plan to whatever this committee's preference is. And I know that Delegate Ballard had to drop off the call a moment ago. And so if we need to circle back around, we can certainly do that.
Okay.
What Adam needs is he needs direction from the committee as to whether or not we want to spread these regional and state funds out over, I guess there's really two questions.
Okay.
One is, do we pursue the securitization question in the short term over the next year or so? And then separate question is, if we don't securitize, do we look at spreading out the revenues that are currently projected over a period of time, or do we simply plan to appropriate those as they come in and get them out the door to the regional projects and state agencies? That's kind of the question that I think he needs some direction on in order to build out the policy with more detail.
Certainly, I appreciate that. And so I want other members of the committee to weigh in, however, in this regard. And I know we're missing the vice chair tonight as well. And so we certainly will value her opinion as she's involved in the community that certainly needs the services that will be there. But I certainly think that we'll probably may need a financial advisor as well to weigh in on the cost of debt, for example, if we secure. But I think we need to go with the understanding, at least, that we're going to outlay the resources we currently have with the $71 million, outlay those to respective localities, and we know what they're getting. And so I certainly want to hear from others as to what their thoughts are in that regard. And of course, we can come up with what is hopefully a reasonable recommendation from you all on which way we should go as well. What is the collective wisdom?
Hey, Jim, this is Todd. Yeah. I certainly agree with your conservative approach. I know there's a beating of the drum, though, that from communities and other legislators that are expecting us to get this money out the door, yes, to projects, and I want to be very conscious of that. Tony, what's your sentiment on that? Can we balance the needs of localities and also protect the longevity of the fund together? Can we do both of those things by taking the conservative approach?
Yes, sir. My recommendation is the second model that Adam shared with you would allow you to have the flexibility if we're receiving more requests, regional request. Well, first of all, the request to cities and counties will be given to them as soon as they're available to be funded. So there's no delay in funding projects that come to us directly from cities and counties. So in any event, they're receiving their direct shares, and they'll receive their OAA funds that they're entitled to each year in a manner that's matches up with the revenue that we have. And so right off the bat, I think that will answer some of those concerns that in the drumbeat that you're hearing from communities. With regard to regional projects, if we tried to plan those out in a more measured approach over a period of number of years, and it just seems like it's not enough money on the front end, the board would always have the ability to increase the appropriation and increase the amount of funding in any given year based on the quality of project proposals that you're seeing. What we need on the front end is a number that we can publish as, look, this is the total amount that the board has budgeted to spend this year in order to set expectations at a certain level, and so that we have some idea of what to bring to the board in terms of requests.
Okay, yeah, I agree. That's a great question, Todd. Yeah, I agree. I think we need to set out the expectations and look at getting those funds certainly out. And as time permits, then we can look at whether we can borrow funds or secure funds, be abundant if the needs are more critical at this point. But going down the road, I think we want to definitely start out with an approach that we can manage well and distribute those funds, because that's going to be another major challenge, how well we can distribute those funds. We have someone that can, certainly with the state has the apparatus in terms of the Health and Human Services Department. So certainly I would favor that approach and getting out what we need and then reassess what the longer term needs are as via the regional projects. I know that may sound a little confusing, but
no, I agree with you, Jim. And as long as Tony, as long as we have the flexibility that you mentioned, you know, if we get a slew of applications that we just feel are great and need to be funded, and we can back up and change some of the reserve that we've talked about, that would, or have a little bit of flexibility anyway. I think that would be great for us, because truly we don't know. I mean, I'm anticipating a slew of applications, but we may not receive as many as I expect. So, and especially quality applications. So, yeah, I feel comfortable, Chairman, with doing the approach that we've discussed. So,
okay, yeah, I'm certainly, Todd, I appreciate that, and I'm certainly in agreement with it. And having that reserved so that we know should we need to ramp up. For example, we may have a multi-year requests, at least 2 years requests that I think some other states have done, such as Tennessee. Their requests is minimum 2 years, so we know what the expectations are in terms of their projected budget, and we know that we have the funds to fund that, and then we can look at what else we need to do going down. We can make decisions as we go, and hopefully they're expending them as required under the legislation, which is going to be critically important to evaluate that.
And as far, Mr. Chairman, as far as securitization, I mean, I've always been, I agree with you. We need to certainly look at the debt service that we would require to do. I think it is something that we should consider.
Yes.
Because everyone wants this money out the door, and that would be an opportunity to have a true knowledge of how much money we would have based on we would know up front, and we could budget better, I think. But anyway, I think it's worth pursuing. I'm not so sure it's worth doing, but until we get further research. But I definitely think if Adam could look into it more, that would be great.
I completely agree. And we can bring in a financial advisor because it will be taxable debt, which will probably have higher interest rates than non-taxable debt. So that's something we need to value as well, what the projected cost would be. I think a financial advisor could really help us with that. Okay.
But Mr. Chairman and Tony, Adam, we don't have a quorum, I guess, anymore, correct? So we can't really make a motion to do either of these things at this time. Is that correct?
Senator, we're sensitive to that. I think at this point, we're looking for some direction.
Okay.
And listening to your comments and to the treasurers, and I think maybe it might be helpful if Adam can have a follow-up call with the other two members as time permits to summarize what we've discussed.
Yeah.
If the chair of the committee is comfortable with that approach, but you know, I've been telling people that a lot of what we're doing, there's a conflict built into trying to move quickly and to at the same time follow all the rules and get everything done exactly right. Cross the T's, dot the I's. We'll continue to try to do that. And we hear your guidance loud and clear on the securitization question. And Mr. Holland on the idea of bringing in a financial advisor. And we will absolutely make that part of our work plan.
Okay, very good. I appreciate that. And certainly I appreciate your discussing with other members of the committee, because we want to get as many people informed and knowledgeable as possible. So as we approach the full body, that the entire committee is comfortable. And so I certainly value that approach, and however we need to do it or whatever, but certainly. And again, I'm really excited about the idea that we can get money moving and know what we can do, and then look at what we can do down the road in terms of cost versus benefit analysis. And I think the benefits of that, obtaining those funds up front, is going to be quite valuable, and maybe more valuable, but that will depend on the demand. However, is the demand is significant? Maybe some localities may not need as much as others. So that will be an impact too. So we'll need to really have a pulse on the demand expectations.
Yes, sir. What I'm hearing in my conversations with localities is that there are definitely some that have a good sense of how they want to spend the money, but there's many others who are just now starting to really think about what they want to do. And I predict that the board will see some really good project requests, regional project requests coming in 2 to 3 years. And we'll see some initially, but we're going to see some really good ones in 2 or 3 years. And so I'm hoping that by having some funds reserved, that we won't be locked into the continuation of all first-year projects, but still have some flexibility to pick up those other projects that come forward in 2025, 2026 that the board has an interest in funding.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the nature of the projects as well. And I think that will be important. So having reserve, I think, is a wise decision. I would recommend or suggest, and I completely agree with Todd in that respect. Anything else we need to do, or are we clear on that?
I'd just like to thank Adam for his work on pulling all this together in a short time frame.
Yeah,
Well
I
done.
greatly appreciate that, Adam. Thank you as well. And if we can get those reports, and also one other thing we want to look at too, those funds earning any interest, what, $71 million. And certainly we have administrative costs. We need to look at our budget and refocus it as we continue to look at and add the things that we need, future employees, for example, and we want to be aware of that as well. So, but it'd be great to have that sort of like cash flow analysis. That would be something that I would love to see. That cash flow analysis, expected revenue and potential expected costs with the grants, et cetera, and direct allocation.
Yes, sir. I mean, that can be provided to you for sure. We've already begun to do that, right? So it's really about, we know we have a kind of a best guess estimate as to when the revenues are going to come in on a fiscal year basis out 20 years, right? How, right, from an expenditure and anticipated expenditure standpoint, how you want to approach those appropriations, right? That's really going to kind of determine what your revenues are coming in, what you're expending in a given year, which yields your new revised balance, and you go down the line to see what you've got to spend in each year. So really kind of depends on the methodology. Of course, securitization changes that quite a bit too. You have a big corpus from which you can draw funds. You can almost like annuitize that, right? If you put that, and then you could potentially invest that and hope that the return on that investment at least makes a dent in the cost of issuance, right? And the cost of issuing the bonds to securitize, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's all that can all be examined. I'm sure there are plenty of entities that would be happy to, especially those that are in the business of facilitating securitization, that would be happy to do an actuarial analysis and cost out quantify what the cost would be to engage in the securitization process in the current market, see what the appetite is for those bonds, those taxable bonds, is what it's my understanding is what they would likely be. So that can absolutely be done, just to at least do due diligence to see fully see what the costs and benefits are. Obviously, the pros and cons that I presented with respect to securitization were without the benefit of an actual proper analysis of what those true costs would be, a holistic kind of high level view of what the costs and benefits might be. So absolutely, we'll do that.
Yeah, I understand. Great. As the chairman, as Mr. Pillar mentioned, Senator Pillar mentioned, we don't have a quorum, so we can't vote. Is there anything else we need to discuss or consider?
No, sir.
Until we meet again.
It's everything I had.
Everything. Okay. Tony, anything else you want to add that we need to contemplate?
No, sir. We appreciate the guidance. We'll follow up with the other committee members, Dr. Melton and Delegate Ballard, to make sure that they're aware of the discussion and gain any feedback that they have. I think Adam did a good job of providing you a kind of a general sense of what our workload is going to be over the next year. There's a lot, obviously, that we're going to have to focus on, and we want to be mindful of the time that each of you are putting into not just this committee, but to your role on the board overall. This is going to be, the first year, 18 months is obviously going to be the most challenging time frame for the authority, and we just appreciate everybody carving out the time this close to the holiday in an evening to join us and help us get some direction on some of these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We appreciate that. And I thank you all for all your hard work in that regard. It will be challenging first year, but I think we'll learn. And also, if we're probably further along than other states, but if there are other things you can learn or ascertain that's going on that might be beneficial to us, will be helpful. Because I know, Tony, you look at news feeds that go around the country. So there may be others trying to move expeditiously as fast as we are, but I agree with Todd. We want to move and we want to put a dent in this crisis and do it so that we are able to make a major impact, really not only the next 3 years to 5 years, but the long term as well.
So, Mr. Chairman, do we need to get back after Tony and Adam have briefed the other two members of the Finance Committee? Would it be appropriate that we reconvene for a very quick meeting just to get some motions in place to advance this to the full committee? Is that what you need from us, Tony?
Yes, I think you probably would. That's a great idea. We want to make sure they're up to date and they're comfortable, and then we can, of course, advance a really good plan or projection at least.
At a really quick reconvene meeting, with just really prepared motions and move forward.
Absolutely. I agree fully. Absolutely. Thank you, Todd. I appreciate that. Anything else from a legal perspective? Mr. Sleetsman, anything you like to add legally that we need to be cognizant of in terms of our accounting systems and things like that?
I have nothing to add at this juncture, but thank you for allowing me some input.
Yeah, appreciate that. Any other comments for the good of the order? If not, then we will not vote because we'll have a quorum. So we will therefore adjourn with the expectations that we'll brief the other members and then reconvene quickly, hopefully to ascertain the step forward for recommendations to the full body. Thank you all again for your outstanding work tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Holland. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah, and be safe and have a great holiday too. All right. Thank you all. Great.